welcome to another ASMR video. And today we're going to be talking about the history of Paris, specifically the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And we'll look at a map from 1844, which details the street layout and just all the nooks and crannies of the city. So to begin with, let's talk about some of the basic history of the city. They found evidence of hunter-gatherers from 8000 BC, and between 250 and 225 BC, the Parisi, a sub-tribe of the Celtic peoples, settled on the banks of the Seine. So they built bridges and minted coins and began to trade with other rival settlements along Europe. In 52 BC, a Roman army invaded and established a Gallo-Roman garrison town called Lutetia. So, as this town and the Roman Empire was Christianized in the 3rd century AD, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, it took on its a more unique and local culture. So it was occupied by Clovis I, who was king of the Franks, and made his capital there in 508. So during the Middle Ages, Paris was the largest city in Europe, and also an important religious and commercial center. So, interestingly, it was also the birthplace of Gothic architecture, which you can see in so many different churches throughout Europe. It was around that time that the University of Paris was organized, sort of in the mid-13th century, and that was one of the first in Europe. In the 1400s, the city was occupied by the Burgundians and English soldiers. So, in the 16th century, Paris became sort of a book publishing capital of Europe. That was really the beginning of the shake-up of the French Wars of Religion, and that was between the Catholics and the Protestants. In the 18th century, Paris was the center of intellectual ferment, as you know, the French Revolution, and the Enlightenment, which was sort of the beginning of the idea of the inalienable rights of man. So in the late 1700s, we had the French Revolution, and following that was Napoleon. So that was really when the city was embellished with monuments throughout the city, and sort of a militant military glory. That was the heyday for that. And then it also became sort of around that time the capital for European fashion, and again, more revolutions. Under Napoleon III, that's when things were sort of rebuilt in the way that you might know them today. That was between 1852 and 1870. So that's the wide avenues, the squares, new parks, and it was really expanded to its present limits in about 1860. So that's when really you start to see millions of tourists, and they see Paris as this sort of a international center. And of course, that's when you see the Eiffel Tower as well. So today, we're just going to look at a beautiful map of Paris in 1844 and really investigate it further. So let's go ahead and take a look over here, and we can zoom in on the map and take a look at the city and see how things have changed, because again, in the 1840s, it was the beginning of that transitional phase. So we can see how maybe it was and what it, compare it. Again, I have a third video coming out, which will show more 19th, 20th, and 21st century, and sort of the streets of Paris today. So we can compare it, and I think that'll be really interesting. So let's go take a look at that map. So let's go ahead and zoom in on this map here. As you can see, it's a map of Paris. And this map is from 1844. So we often just zoom straight into these maps and we don't give them as much thought as we should. And let's talk maybe a little bit about what this map is for here. The cost of producing maps was very expensive. And since maps were largely produced using copper plate engraving, what was needed was a template. And this map of Paris shows how a template can be used for mass production and for other types of specific maps. So each map was devoted to a particular topic, such as markets, lighting districts, sewers, and the thematic layer was added by hand using color. So because the base map was printed in monochrome, the added color was able to highlight and bring focus to the details perfectly. The underlying consistent geography gave the Parisian engineers and bureaucrats a way of situating the themes in the city. So, at the time of this map, it was around the French Industrial Exposition of 1844, which was held in a temporary structure on the Champs-Élysées in Paris. Paris was known as the capital of the 19th century among historians. So let's put things into context. In the 18th century or 1700s, Paris was the center of the intellectual ferment known as the Enlightenment. And the main stage of the French Revolution, which was in the late 1700s, from 1789 to 1799. So we've got a few different periods intersecting here, and after that point, because it was really a time of great change in France. So to begin with, we have the First French Empire under Napoleon, which was from 1804 to 1814 or 1815. Then we have the Bourbon Restoration under Louis the 18th and also Charles the 10th, which was from 1815 to 1830. So after that was the July monarchy, and that was under Louis Phillipe d'Orléans, 1830 to about 1848. And lastly, the Second Republic under Napoleon III, which was after that in 1848 until 1852. So, between 1795 and 1866, metropolitan France, without its overseas or colonial possessions, was the second most popular country of Europe, behind Russia, and the fourth most populous country in the world, behind China, India, and then, of course, as I mentioned, Russia as well. So by 1850, which was 6 years after this map was made, its population was around 36 million in total. This is also the time of additional French colonialism. So in 1830, France invaded Algeria, and in 1848 this North African country was fully integrated into France. And just to add, the later part of the 19th century saw France embark on a massive program of overseas imperialism, and that included French Indochina, in modern-day Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos, and Africa as well. So, until 1850, the population growth was mainly in the countryside, but a period of slow urbanization began under the Second Empire. So unlike in England, industrialization was a late phenomenon in France. France's economy in the 1830s had a limited iron industry and underdeveloped coal supplies, and the great majority lived on farms. A lot of the systems that led to the industrialization were created until later on in the 19th century in France. So, for example, French rail transport only began in the 1830s and would not truly develop until 1840s, using British imported engineers. And there was a large gap between the elites and the poor at this time. So if you just close your eyes and transport yourself into Paris and into France of the 1800s, and it was still a beautiful place, but it was going through a lot of change, and the peasants there, about 1/3 of the population, was illiterate. So that was actually recorded in 1870, so in 1840s you can imagine. It's probably a bit higher. So that would be quite difficult for people who cannot read to get work. And it was a mixed bag economically in terms of there was irregular periods of growth and stagnation. So to get a sense of the feelings around these times, let's start with Napoleon. And Napoleon was in power from 1804 to 1815, or 1814, with a brief 100 days where he kind of returned. And that was a period of expansionism and kind of extreme social reform. And after that, France entered into a time of relative peace and stability, both politically and socially, and entered into a period called the Bourbon Restoration, which lasted till about 1830. And this was the time of Louis XVIII and the restoration of the old monarchy system post-Napoleon. So France regained its place among the respected major powers, and it was a voice that was heard in the world of international diplomacy. So there was a new sense of humanitarianism and popular piety, and France began to rebuild the empire it had lost in 1763. And the lifestyles of these classes were also quite large. The first cafe in Paris had been opened in 1672, and in the 1700s, early 1700s, there was up to 400 cafes. So by the time of this map in the 1800s, And there was perhaps even double that number, and so the visitors may have noticed that there was that cafe and bourgeois culture, but and also grand boulevards and stunning monuments. And the other Paris, which was winding, narrow alleyways and winding streets. And it really wasn't, in fact, all of Paris was meant to be transformed into that, except that you see over here in West Paris. But due to economic circumstances, that didn't quite work out that way. So, for example, there was reported some poverty and strange trades of the 19th century Paris, such as an indoor farmer keeping 52 goats in his home, or very minor aristocrats who scraped a living acknowledging other people's illegitimate children. There was a large Paris street gang culture around this time, also known as Apaches, and they were like modern gangsters. And they were very aware of their image. They wanted to look cool, dress hip, but they were also quite violent as well. And they knew how to get the right kind of press to keep this image up. So, one example of these gangs, these pageant gangs, was called the beauty spots. And they had a mole tattooed under their lip as their calling card. So, a few years after this map was created, there was a larger war of streets and houses carried out by a friend of Napoleon, Baron Haussmann, Napoleon III, that is. And that was really from 1853 onward. And it replaced the old Paris with the 19th century city that we have today, that's more almost like a piece of art. And in the 18th century, Napoleon sort of embellished the city with monuments to military glory. And he asked his friend, the Baron Haussmann, to be in charge of the huge renovation that introduced new parks, wide boulevards, and improved public services. He also wanted to highlight some of the best monuments of the city, planning his streets to show the landmarks from every angle. Ile de la Cité and the area around the opera were the most changed. During this renovation, it became the European capital of fashion and the scene of two more revolutions during this time, in 1830 and 1848. It wasn't until Napoleon III when the center of Paris became rebuilt. So, under Napoleon III, between 1852 and 1870, that we see those new parks, and the city was expanded to its present limits in around 1860, which is still about even 16 years after this map was created. In the later part of the century, millions of tourists came to see Paris in international expositions, and the new Eiffel Tower, which that was in 1887, so when this map was created, it was much more before that time. So Paris was different a bit in this time. So now that we've established some context, let's talk more in detail about it. So a little bit before this, Paris grew quickly and passed 800,000 people in 1830. Between 1828 and 1860, the city built a horse-drawn omnibus system that was the world's first mass public transport system. It greatly speeded the movement of people inside the city and became a model for other cities. The old Paris street names carved into stone on walls were replaced. And you just get, again, if you just visualize royal blue metal plates with the street names in white letters, which is the model still used today. The fashionable new neighborhoods were built on the right bank around the church of St. Vincent de Paul, and that's over in this area here, north of the Louvre. And this area here became known as the New Athens neighborhood during the Restoration and July monarchy, and it was the home of many great artists and writers. The Restoration period, which involved Louis XVIII, whom had was succeeded by his brother, Charles X, in 1824. And this new government became increasingly unpopular with both the upper classes and the general population of Paris. And this led to the beginning of a new leader known as Louis Phillipe. And the Paris of Louis Philippe, King Louis Philippe, was the city described in the novels of Victor Hugo. The population of that time increased from 800,000 in 1830 to 1,053,000 in 1848. So as the city grew north and west, the poorest neighborhoods in the center became even more densely crowded. In the heart of the city, around a place called Ile de la Cité, it's this island here with Saint-Chappelle and Notre Dame here. And it was a maze of narrow, winding streets and crumbling buildings from earlier centuries. It was picturesque, but dark and crowded. It was dangerous as well, and water was distributed by porters carrying buckets from a pole on their shoulder. And the sewers emptied into the River Seine. So a cholera outbreak in 1832 killed 20,000 people. And Louis Philippe, he made efforts to improve the center of the city. He paved the way for caves of the Seine with stone paths and planted trees along the river. He built new streets and trying to connect the markets here with the Louvre. I think it's called Les Ayes. Our pronunciation is probably going to be mediocre in this video, that said. So that's a market here. That's sort of the central market of Paris. And that was really finished by Napoleon III after this map it was made in 1848 and further. So Louis Philippe lived in the ancestral Orleans family residence of the House of Orleans, and he lived here in the Palais Royal, which was you see the pictures on Instagram with the pillars, and it's like a very famous photograph. And that was actually his home before he moved into the Tuileries Palace over here. And His chief contribution to the monuments of Paris was the completion of the Place des Concords in 1836. So that's over here. And also, it's actually that very popular square that you see, almost like the Times Square of Paris, and they put the Luxor Obelisk, which weighs up 250 tons, and that was carried from France to Egypt, or from Egypt to France, on a specially built ship. So, that said, the Champs-Élysées on the western end was completed, and the Arc de Triomphe was completed, which was begun actually much earlier in the time of Napoleon. So, an interesting story, but the ashes of Napoleon were returned to Paris from St. Helena in a ceremony on 15th of December 1840 at the Invalides, which is here. And Louis Philippe, he placed the statue of Napoleon in the place Vendome here. And he completed a column in the Place de la Bastille, which is over here. He began the restoration of the churches of Paris, which were damaged during the French Revolution. So, the first railway stations in Paris were built under Louis Philippe, and each belonged to a different company. They were not connected to each other and were outside the center of the city. The first, called the Embarcadere de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, was opened on the 24th of August in 1837 on the Place d'Europe, which I believe is over in this area, but known under a different name. An early version of the Gare Saint-Lazare was begun in 1842, and the first lines, Paris-Orleans and Paris-Rouen, were inaugurated on the 1st and 2nd of May, 1843. So, as the population of Paris grew, so did the discontent of the working-class neighborhoods. There were riots in 1830, 1831, 1832, 1835, and 1839, as well as 1840. The 1832 uprising was immortalized in Victor Hugo's novel Les Miserables. So the growing unrest finally exploded on the 23rd of February in 1848, which is 4 years after this map was created. And when a large demonstration was broken up, barricades went up in the eastern working class neighborhoods, and it was pretty much a time of open disdain for the king. So, yeah, that was kind of when things changed and went to Napoleon III, who was the last of the royal styled leaders, monarchies of France. So, in the 1790s, Paris was divided into 12 arrondissements, and they were numbered on the 11th of October, 1795. Paris was divided into 12 arrondissements. They were numbered from west to east, with the numbers 1 through 9 situated on the right bank of the Seine, and the numbers 10 through 12 on the left bank. Each arrondissement was subdivided into 4 quarters, which corresponded to the 48 original districts created in 1790. As mentioned previously, Emperor Napoleon III and the prefect of the Seine, Baron Haussmann, they developed a plan to incorporate several of the surrounding communes into the Paris jurisdiction in the late 1850s. Parliament passed the legislation in 1859, and the 12 arrondissements were reorganized from 12 into 20. So the current city is divided into 20 different administrative districts. So that's the beginning of the current shape of Paris. So the first arrondissement starts in this area here. So the 20 arrondissements are arranged to form a clockwise spiral starting from the middle of the city. Let's talk a little bit about Louis Philippe. The reign of Louis Philippe is known as the July Monarchy and was dominated by wealthy industrialists and bankers. He followed conservative policies under the influence of statesman François Guizot, and that was during 1840 to 1848, which is the same time as this map was created. So they promoted a friendship with Britain and sponsored colonial expansion. Most notably was the expansion into Algeria, but his popularity faded as economic conditions in France deteriorated in 1847, and he was forced to abdicate, where he then, which was actually another French Revolution in 1848, if you did not know, and he then lived his life in exile in the United Kingdom. So his supporters were known as Orleanists, and it's really the main line of, or a separate line of the House of Bourbon. So, Louis Philippe ruled in an unpretentious fashion, sort of avoiding the pomp and lavish spending of his predecessors. Despite his outward appearance and simplicity, his support did come from wealthy bourgeois, and he was beloved at first, as we mentioned. And that said, the conditions of the working classes deteriorated, and the income gap widened considerably, as we also spoke about. So, this, an agricultural and industrial depression in 1846 led to that revolution, and that's just 2 years after this map was created. So, as you can imagine, it's just a general period of great change. And that revolution was known as the February Revolution, and it was just the beginning of a wave of revolutions around that period of time in Europe. So that led to the creation of the Second Republic, which was known as the June Days Uprising, and it was essentially they installed Napoleon III into the throne, or onto the throne, and made him the quote-unquote president. So his authority was based in peasant support. So that was when, that was pretty much the end of that period. So now that we've sort of set the scene for this map, let's talk a little bit about what we have on here, and kind of imagine what Paris may have looked like at this time, given all the things I just said, and what it must have been like just zooming in your head on one of these streets and just imagining the scenes. So let's go ahead and go through some of this here. So I've got my trusty pointer here, and we're going to go ahead and look at the first point on this map, which is right here. And this is the Quai d'Orsay. And this, the building of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was developed right as this map was being created, so 1844. And there was many statues on the facade. And that's actually where the Treaty of Versailles was written. And currently, this is where the Musée d'Orsay is currently located. So it's interesting because that wasn't created till 1898. So this map predates that period. Next we have the Place Vendome, and this was laid out in 1702 as a monument to the glory of the armies of Louis XIV. And the original column was started in 1806 at Napoleon's direction and completed in 1810. And so it was modeled after Trajan's column to celebrate the victory of Austerlitz, so similar to Rome. And this is now currently renowned with fashionable deluxe hotels such as the Ritz and maybe many famous dress designers that have salons in the square. Next we have Saint-Chappelle, which is a royal chapel in the Gothic style. And this is within the medieval Palais de la Cité, which is the residence of the King of France until the 14th century. And I'll explain more about this island later, but it's where Paris really began. So there's a tradition here. So construction for this chapel began in 1238 and finished in 1248. It's considered one of the highest achievements of Gothic architecture. And it was commissioned by Louis IX of France to house the collection of the Passion relics, including the Crown of Thorns, which was one of the most important relics in medieval Christendom. So it was later that was hosted in the Notre Dame Cathedral till it was burned down recently, unfortunately. So, although this cathedral was damaged during the French Revolution, it was restored in the 19th century. So most of the chapel as it appears today is a recreation, although nearly 2/3 of the windows are authentic. So it suffered a very grievous destruction in the 18th century during that revolution when the steeple was removed and the relics were dispersed. And though some survived, as I mentioned, in the treasury of the Notre Dame. So it had one of the most extensive 13th century stained glass collections anywhere in the world. And it was requisitioned as a archival depository in 1803, so 2 meters worth of glass was removed to facilitate working light and put on the market. So unfortunately, some of the original glass was removed. So, but again, it is a recreation, despite that. So next we have the Luxembourg Gardens. So in 1611, Marie de Medici, who was the widow of Henry IV and the regent for King Louis VIII, he decided to build a palace right here, and it is an imitation of the Pitti Palace in native Florence. She purchased the Hotel du Luxembourg, which is today the Petit Luxembourg Palace, and she began construction of a new palace. So they built a very famous fountain, which I believe is right here on this map. This little brown spot here. And it still exists today. I believe it was moved a little bit, however, if I'm not mistaken. but she planted 2,000 elm trees and really directed a series of gardeners to build a park in the style that she had known as a child in Florence. Following the French Revolution, the French Directory expanded the gardens and confiscated the lands of a nearby Carthusian order of monks. So the architect of the Arc de Triomphe took the task of restoring the garden. He sort of laid out the Medici fountain in its current location and preserved the nursery garden of the Carthusian order and the old vineyards, and kept the garden in a formal French style. So during and after the July monarchy, the park became the home of a large population of statues. The Queen and the famous women of France lined along the terraces. So this fountain was built, as I mentioned, by Marie de Medici, and it was in the form of a grotto, which was very popular in the Italian Renaissance gardens. And again, it was restored, but they're featured prominently in Victor Hugo's novel, Les Miserables, and it's actually where one of the principal love stories of the novel unfolds. So you'll notice here that there's no Eiffel Tower. And as I said, that wasn't created until 1887. And Paris without the Eiffel Tower is almost it's hard to imagine in a way. That said, the Eiffel Tower at first was considered an eyesore. So back then it wasn't as well received as it is today. So next we have the Champs du Mars, and that was originally a part of a flat open area, which was reserved for market gardening. So citizens would claim small plots and grow fruits, vegetables, and flowers for the local market. But it was not a very fertile place, so it was repurposed for other things, as we know today. But it was the site of the first Bastille Day, which was held here. Next, we noticed over here, there's no opera house, and that was not created until 1861. So, next we have the Jardin Tuileries, and that was created by Catherine de' Medici as the garden of the Tuileries Palace in 1564, and it was eventually opened to the public in 1667 and became a public park after the French Revolution in the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. In the 19th century, the Tuileries Garden was the place where ordinary Parisians went to relax, meet, stroll, and enjoy the fresh air and greenery. Napoleon Bonaparte, who was to become emperor, moved into the Tuileries Palace in 1800. And he began making improvements to suit an imperial residence. A new street was created between the Louvre and the palace and the Place de Carousel, which is right here. And that street was called Riva, which you can see here. Rivoli, excuse me. There's Rivoli Street here. Not Riva. And he built actually in this Place de Carousel a small fenced courtyard where he built a triumphal arch, which was modeled after the Arch of Septimus Severus in Rome. So it was really a ceremonial entrance to his palace right in this area. And so, of course, it's very different today. In 1801, Napoleon ordered the construction of this new street, and it had previously been occupied by the riding school and stables built by Marie de Medici in the private gardens of aristocrats and convents of religious orders that had been closed during the Revolution. In 1830, after King Louis-Philippe got into power, he became the owner of the Tuileries, and he wanted a private garden within the Tuileries, so a section of the garden in front of the palace was separated by a fence from the rest of the Tuileries. So a small moat, flower beds, and 8 new statues, which were made by sculptors of the period, were decorated throughout the private part of the garden. In 1852, when Napoleon III got into power, he became the owner of the garden, and he enlarged his own private part of it much further. So it went further to the west and as far as the north and south alley, which you can see here. And that crossed the large round basin, so it sort of included a bunch of areas over here as well. So next we have the Champs-Élysées, which is this road right here. And the Champs-Élysées back then was this area here. This was known as another, I think, Avenue de Neuilly. That's how you say it. But the Champs-Élysées was, but now it's this street leading up, in this area, shopping area leading up to the Arc de Triomphe. So originally it was an area of fields, and although Paris had been a city for many centuries, it wasn't as spread out as it is now, and this, as well, I mentioned the Champs-Élysées. It was a place where vegetables were grown, and the merchants who grew here sold their goods in the Paris markets, not too far to travel with perishables, which I mentioned the markets over here, so very close by. In the early 17th century, French Queen Marie de Medici, who loved her Tuileries garden, decided to create an avenue of trees where these fields lie, so that's when the change began. In the late 17th century, the great French gardener André Lenotre was called upon to update the area even more. So, over the years, this corridor of trees, which was part of the Tuileries garden, grew, and in the early 18th century, 1709, it was given the name Avenue des Champs-Élysées, and that name translates to the Elysian Fields, which is where the Greek gods and heroes went after death, according to Greek mythology. So during the 18th century, grand houses and buildings were erected along the avenue, and the Élysée Palace, which is right here, became the official home of the French president, and that area was the location for palaces and fabulous buildings of the rich and aristocrats since the 1600s. But by the 1800s, it just became a very fashionable spot. In 1828, it was declared a civic property of Paris, and that's when you get the commission of fountains and gas lamps and cleared footpaths all along this path here to the Arc de Triomphe. So it was also the location of one of the World's Fairs, which was very famous back in those times, but also the French Industrial Exposition of 1844, which is the same year this map was held. So you can imagine the avenue strewn with expositions of new technology and industrial strength. So let's go to the next item here, which is down the road in the Arc de Triomphe, which is one of the most famous monuments in Paris. So if you stand at the western end of the Champs-Élysées at the center of Place Charles de Gaulle, it's where it's located. And the Arc de Triomphe honors those who fought and died for France in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, with the names of all French generals and victories inscribed on its inner and outer surfaces. Beneath the vault lies the tomb of the unknown soldier as well. So, along its walls are the images of French youths fighting against bearded Germanic warriors in chainmail, and it really set the tone for public monuments with triumphant, patriotic messages. It was inspired by the Arch of Titus in Rome, Italy, and it's about 164 feet or 50 meters. So it was commissioned in 1806 after the victory at Austerlitz by Emperor Napoleon, and that was at the peak of his fortune, so laying the foundations alone took 2 years, and in 1810, Napoleon went through the arch with his bride, Marie Louise of Austria, and initially they had a wooden mock-up completed in construction. In fact, it took so long in 1811, the main architect died and another one had to be commissioned. So it would not be completed until the reign of King Louis Philippe, which was at the time of this map, 1833 and 1836, just a few years before it was made. So, as mentioned previously, on the 15th of December 1840, Napoleon's ashes were brought back to France from St. Helena, and the ashes went under the arch on its final resting place down here to Les Invalides. And also prior to his burial, Victor Hugo was buried for the night of May 22nd, 1885, on his way to the Panthéon, which is down over in this area here. Although, I believe it was a church at the time of this map. Next we have the Trocadero, which is over here. And the Trocadero was a place that was, well, now it's very famous for photographs of the Eiffel Tower. But the promenade wasn't created until 1867 at the World's Fair exhibition, so none of those Instagram photos in front of the Eiffel Tower for you, unfortunately, at this time. And you can also see there was no Pont Alexander III. Instead, you see a Pont des Invalides. So, again, this was before that beautification as well. So next we go to the Panthéon, which is down over here. And this is in the 5th arrondissement. It is located in the area known as the Latin Quarter. By the time the construction was finished, the French Revolution had started, and the It was a church, actually, the Church of Saint Genevieve, and they decided in 1791 to turn it into a mausoleum for the most distinguished French citizens. And this was modeled after the Panthéon in Rome. And it was reused this way since the 16th century, but then oddly it was twice restored to a church. So in the French Third Republic, until the French Third Republic, which they decreed its exclusive use as a mausoleum. So Napoleon in 1801 agreed to restore the church properties. So this became the cathedral, became a cathedral again, and back and forth. And although the church of the crypt of the church kept its official function, it just went back and forth. So on to Louis Philippe. So around the time of this map, they expressed sympathy for revolutionary values, and the church once again became the Pantheon. So no new remains were added, and it was closed to the public. But then it was again, it was designated a Temple of Humanity. So that's when they kind of changed things. So actually, interestingly, in 1848, the Pantheon was returned to the church with the title of National Basilica. So the remaining relics of Saint Genevieve were restored to the church. And interestingly, today, some famous people buried there include Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Alexander Dumas. So next we have the Louvre, which is over here. And it's the world's largest art museum. And it's a central landmark of the city. It's located on the bank of the Seine in the city's first arrondissement. And in today's world, it receives 9.6 million visitors, so it's the world's most visited museum. Now, before it was a museum, it housed the Louvre Palace, originally built in the 12th century under Philip II. Remnants of the fortress are visible in the basement of the museum, but due to urban expansion, the fortress eventually lost its defensive function. And in 1546, Francis I converted it into the primary residence of the French kings. The building was extended many times to form the present Louvre Palace. In 1682, Louis XIV chose the Palace of Versailles for his household. So it was leaving the Louvre really for a place to display the royal collection, including collections of ancient Greek and Roman sculptures. So it was at that point that the National Assembly declared that the Louvre should be for art. And actually the museum part of it opened in 1793. So it was the first anniversary of the monarchy's demise. And at first, the public was given free accessibility on 3 days per week, which was perceived as a major accomplishment. At that time, the museum had 537 paintings and 184 objects of art. During the restoration with Louis XVIII and Charles X, they added 135 pieces at the cost of 720,000 francs, which is a lot of money even in today's world. And they created the Department of Egyptian Antiquities. So that actually made the size of the collection increased to about 7,000 works. And then after this map, just a few years, in 1858 and 1870, under Napoleon III, the museum added 20,000 new pieces to its collection. So there was really a lot of exponential growth throughout that time period. Now, it wasn't all roses in terms of the responsibility of taking the spoils of war. Several churches and palaces, including St. Mark's Basilica, were looted by the French, which outraged the Italians. One of the most famous pieces taken under this scenario was the Horses of St. Mark. The 4 antique bronze horses which adorned the Basilica of San Marco in Venice after the sack of Constantinople in 1204 were brought to Paris to reside atop Napoleon's Arc du Carousel, as we mentioned here. So the Italian peninsula was not the only region from which Napoleon took art. Under the Directory government of the 1790s, Napoleon, who was then a general, led an expedition to Egypt. The campaign was an expansionist effort on the part of the government, but the Directory had the goal to make Paris the center of art, science, and culture. The Directory wanted France to assume responsibility for liberating the works of art they deemed in danger in order to protect and nationalize the heritage and culture of the subjects. This is, of course, an ongoing issue even today. So as a result, there were teams of artists and scientists who accompanied the armies into battle, equipped with lists of paintings, sculptures, and other pieces that would be collected, crated, and then shipped back to France. In 1806, the construction of the Arc de Triomphe du Carousel began, and that's here that arc I mentioned, and that began situated between the two western wings, and that was to commemorate Emperor Napoleon's military victories, which was completed in 1808. So, in the mid-19th century, old houses still actually encroached on the Place du Carousel, and it was during the Second Empire that these old houses were swept clear of the Place du Carousel, and the huge complex of the Louvre Tuileries, whose master plan had been envisioned 3 centuries earlier, was finally completed by the Richelieu wing, which is the northern wing of the Louvre along the Rue de Rivoli, as I mentioned, and the Denon wing to the south. So now we're going to check out the Avenue Saint-Marcel. So that's down in this area here, and I'm going to show you a picture here of what it looked like actually during this time. So we have photographs of this time period. And this is a place that witnessed some very interesting events. But as you can imagine, this is sort of a typical Parisian street. Next we have something really interesting, and that's this stream here. You can sort of see it meandering along. And many people may wonder, there's not a river in Paris besides the Seine. Well, actually back in that day, there was a river called La River, and it's actually started down here near Kellerman Park and would run along here all the way to the current Gare d'Austerlitz train terminal. In this, we're going to see some pictures here of the river, but it was, as you can see, it was a rough area. and it was buried because of the pollution from the tanneries. And you can see over here, there's Rue de Riviere, some of the streets along the river, and it was really a place of industrial workshops and things like that. So you can imagine it was very polluted back in those times. So on the 28th of April, 1828, the first Paris omnibus service began. You can think of it as a sort of a fancy stagecoach running every 15 minutes between the Madeleine and the Bastille. Before long, there was 100 omnibuses in service, and I'm going to show you a photo of them here. And it's pretty similar to modern transportation, but with horses. And there was 18 different itineraries, and a journey generally costs about 25 centimes. I don't know what that translates into today's money. So the omnibuses circulated between 7 in the morning and 7 in the evening, and it could carry between 12 and 18 passengers. So the busiest line was that along the Grand Boulevards, like over here, and really ran from 8 in the morning till midnight. So certain lines ran later than others. By 1845, there was actually 13 companies, so during the time of this map, and they were operating 20 to 23 omnibus lines. This also included an omnibus known as the Imperiale, and this was the first double-decker buses. So the upper floor was cheaper and often uncovered. And really the omnibus service was an immediate popular success, with more than 2.5 million passengers in the first 6 months. However, there was no reliable way to collect money from the passengers, and many of the fare collectors kept much of the money for themselves. In the first years, the company was continually on the verge of bankruptcy and in despair. So actually, the founder committed suicide in February of 1830, which is really sad, but his partners reorganized the company and they managed to keep it in business. So, moving on, we have the Bassin d'Arsenal. You can see it here, Bassin d'Arsenal, and that's the part of Arsenal which is still around today. Let's see, we have the Quai St. Bernard. You see that right here. Quai St. Bernard was the other side of the street there. And we have Rue Tronchet, which goes up to the first train station or second train station, Gare Saint-Lazare, completed in 1837. Next, we've got the Fontaine des Elephants, which is just north of the Arsenal. And there was a monument in Paris which existed between 1813 and 1846. The statue was created or conceived of in 1808 by Napoleon I, and it was a colossal statue to be made out of bronze, about 78 feet in height. The model became very recognizable and was immortalized by Victor Hugo in his novel Les Miserables. And it was built at the site of the Bastille, but the original construction never really survived, so the elephant was replaced a few years later by the July column, by 1840. So there's still some remainder of that here. It was actually, even back in those days, it was fairly worn down and decrepit by the time it was removed. So you can actually read a petition in the 20s that were talking about how it was an eyesore. So that was really funny. You have the, here we are, Boulevard St. Andrew, which is just northwest of the Bastille. We have the Ile de Louis, Ile de Lai, which is near this. Another really interesting one we have is the Porte aux Vins and the Quai du Tournelle. So right here you can see this Alvin, and the first Alvin, which is a wine market, was situated at the current location of the Institut du Monde Arabe's courtyard, and it was built between 1663 and 1665. And it was very close to the sun so that they could ship wine in and out of the city. This original hall was associated with an abbey, which had a relationship with winemaking, and that was a consistent theme. All wine merchants were permitted to trade at the new market, and they were charged a half livre per muid of wine sold, so that's an old French unit of measurement for volumes. I don't know, again, what that translates into today's money. But then in the 19th century, demand for wine from overseas markets, including England and Holland, skyrocketed. The Industrial Revolution had brought mechanized production methods to the table, making it possible to scale up like never before. Starting at the beginning of the century, wine consumption rose and continued to do so over the course of most of the century. Demand for wine more than tripled in France between 1800 and 1865. So, on the orders of Emperor Napoleon I, a new, much larger wine market was built to meet this new craze, which was completed in 1845, 1 year after this map. So, much of it was covered in. And we can see some pictures here of how it looked. It's just big barrels of wine and lots of people moving things around. And it was two large buildings occupied several streets around the Quai St. Bernard, as I mentioned, along here. And that included the space used by the previous hall and land once occupied by the St. Victor Abbey. So its vast lanes were named after the France's main winemaking regions, Champagne, Bordeaux, Bourgogne. You can see, if you look very closely here, Rue de Bourgogne, and also Languedoc as well. They're all named after the famous wine regions. And this place attracted merchants from all across the country. Had warehouses of hundreds of underground cellars, and this new Alvin was able to store enormous quantities of wine, about 500,000 casks, but it couldn't keep up with the ever-increasing demand, particularly following the advent of industrial rail transport and speeding distribution standards. As a result, the new network of warehouses were built nearby. I'm near the Porte de Bercy, which is actually over here. I'm over in this area here, which is on the opposite side. And that really would become the more important area in the 20th century following the expansion. So, Quai St. Bernard and Bercy continued to be important sites really well into the 20th century, but in the mid-20th century, Paris rapidly modernized, and this model was no longer needed. So here's one interesting street, Boulevard Morland. It looks like they filled that in today's world because this island doesn't exist, I don't believe. Next, we're going to go over here. And we've got the Plaine-Monceux. And that was an ambitious subdivision project. In 1837, Plaine-Monceux was unsuccessful, and the territory remained mostly rural until about 1854, which was the opening of Boulevard Paris, which I believe is over here. And this was the first major route in this territory. And this district was mostly an agricultural space between the farmer's wall, the fortified enclosure built. And this was really went along Asnieres Road to the north and the current Rue de Tocqueville to the east. And this included the outside part of the wall of the Farmers General, which I'll talk about later. In most of this area, there were not even roads outside a few winding rural roads. So now it's kind of a place where embassies and other cultural institutions are located. Next, we see the Plaine des Chalots, which is a village of the same name located in this area about 2 times larger than the current area. And in 1659 became a suburb of Paris. And then it was really split by the wall later on, the Farmers' Wall, and became one of the precincts of Paris, built just before the Revolution. The purpose of this wall was to enable the Ferme General, which is like a sort of a bureaucratic entity, to collect a tax on the goods entering the city. So it went kind of all throughout the city, and it was 24 kilometers long. This was actually destroyed in 1860 during the extension of Paris to the enclosure of Thiers. So, to the west of that wall, the Plaine des Places divided the rural territory between the Avenue de Neuilly and the current Avenue de la Grande Armée to the north. So it was really extending along these rural roads. Then in 1818, around the time of this map, the chemist Charles de Rosny set up his workshop for the construction of distillation equipment. The company developed and extended over a 2-hectare site between the Seine and the current location of the factory, which was built for machine tools. And then after 1844, I was involved in the making of locomotives and was the most important industrial company of Paris, employing up to 1,300 workers in 1850. The locomotives were assembled at the factory of Chalots, up to 25 at a time from elements manufactured at the Grenelle factory. And there were boilers with brass tubes, wheels, and axles, and after assembly they were painted and varnished in Chalots and transported to the belt line on carts weighing 16 to 18 tons, and drawn by a large number of horses, up to 42. The factory also manufactured sugar equipment with boilers used for the evaporation and cooking, and built various machines for railways. And this factory was destroyed by fire on the night of December 24th, 1865. So next we have Montmartre, which is one of my favorite places. And Montmartre is one of, it's very beautiful. It's been occupied from at least the Gallo-Roman times. And texts from the 8th century cite the name of Mons Mercuri, or Mount Mercury, and in the 9th century, a text speaks of Mount Mars, so Montmartre. Very similar name. And excavations in 1975 north of the Church of St. Pierre found coins from the 3rd century and the remains of a major wall. Earlier excavations in the 17th century found vestiges of Roman baths from the 2nd century. Montmartre is primarily known for its artistic history, with the white domed Basilica of the Sacré-Cœur. But of course, at this time, there was no Sacré-Cœur, and also had a nightclub district as well, or it has that today. The other church, the Saint-Pierre de Montmartre, was built in 1147, and was the church of the prestigious Montmartre Abbey. So, back in this time, or in 1790, Montmartre was located just outside the limits of Paris, and that year became the commune of Montmartre, with its town hall located on the site of the former abbey. The main businesses of the commune were winemaking. There's still vestiges of that here today. Stone quarry and gypsum mines. The mines of gypsum had begun in the Gallo-Roman period, first in open-air mines and then underground, and continued until 1860. And these gypsum blocks were cut into blocks and baked and then ground and put into sacks. Russian soldiers occupied Montmartre during the Battle of Paris in 1814, and they used the altitude of the hill for artillery bombing of the city. So Montmartre remained just outside the city limits until January 1st, 1860, which is 16 years after this map was created, hence why it's really far up here. And then it was annexed to the city along with other communities surrounding Paris, as we mentioned, and it became part of the 18th arrondissement of Paris. And that really led to, in 1871, when Montmartre was the site of the beginning of the revolutionary uprising of the Paris Commune. And then, near the end of the 19th century, the Belle Epoque, which is when many artists such as Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Pablo Picasso, and Vincent van Gogh lived and created and painted, and it was just a very creative community there that we all know and love. Now we have another town here, and that is called Therns, and that's over here. And it was a small country village surrounded by forests and swamps on the slopes of a wooded hill. And it was deemed safe and full of game, called a root mountain. Apart from a few crops and meager pastures, this was a plain of royal hunting and wilderness. And really it was small woods. And it really remained in use until the Revolution. So in the beginning, it was a modest hamlet. In 1755, there was only 18 houses. But then the village of Therns began to grow rapidly. And at the beginning of the 19th century, Paris, as it moved west, really filled out this area. And in Therns, as in Monceux, the first nucleus was formed around a religious establishment and not a feudal residence, or was not formed around a religious establishment. So it became a castle, and around this castle, the hamlet of Therns developed. So there was the construction of fortifications, and ultimately it isolated this district from the rest of the commune to this area here. But it remained administratively attached until 1863 when it was annexed. Around 1820, a few real estate developers made some huge speculation about development of the area, and the surroundings of the castle were covered with houses, in particular along the Rue de Villiers and the Rue de Saint-Germain, Avenue de Therns. And so next we have the Parc Monceux, and the park is unusual in France due to its English style. Its one formal layout, curved walkways, and randomly placed statues, which distinguish it from the more traditional French-style gardens. In 1860, the park was purchased by the city, and it became the first public park in Paris to be created by Baron Haussmann as part of that grand transformation of Paris under Napoleon that I mentioned to you. Now let's go over this across the map here to Charonne, and that's a little town there. So in 1008, Robert II of France the Pious gave Charonne to an abbey, and it changed hands many times. But in that time, a small locality developed around the castle of Charonne, which was annexed by Paris in 18 1660. Now we're going to move on to this area here, the Place du Trône, which is also now called the Place de la Nation, and it's on the border of the 11th and 12th arrondissements, widely known for having the most active guillotines during the French Revolution. The square was renamed Place de la Nation, Place de la Nation, on Bastille Day on July 1880 under the Third Republic. During the Revolution, the square was renamed the Square of the Toppled Throne, and a guillotine was set up in the southern half of the square. And those that were buried there were buried in the Picpus Cemetery. And Picpus is actually down in this area here. And to this day, Paris bears the traces of the Farmers' General Wall that I mentioned, and this wall was built between 1784 and 1791, and the plan was to really encircle houses, gardens, and monasteries for the purpose of controlling the flow of goods and to enable their taxation. So the wall's construction left a vast grassy space with vines and market gardens as far as the medieval city wall and the walls of the gardens of the old village of Picpus. So over here. And that kind of area really gave rise to the welcoming of Louis XIV and Maria Theresa of Spain. In 1660, they created a throne for their solemn arrival, and that kind of gave the square its original name, the Square of Thrones, or the Square of Throne, Place du Trône. We can also see over here another area. It's Fontarabie, which is a township also on the wall. So the wall sort of surrounded the outer edges. Over here. And sort of encircled everything here. And so now we're going to go to another spot here, the Cemetiere Sud, which is right here. And that is now known as the Cemetery at Montparnasse, and it was originally as the Southern Cemetery, opened in 1824. So in the 19th century, cemeteries were banned in Paris due to health concerns. Several new cemeteries outside the precincts of the capital replaced the internal Parisian ones. Montmartre's cemetery in the north, the Cemetiere Sud in the south, and it's also known as Montparnasse Cemetery, and they were replaced with the Cemetiere des Innocents and some of the others. So it was kind of a movement. And many of those were also buried into the catacombs. So during this time, the city of Paris attained the estate and surrounding grounds in order to create a cemetery for the burial of people who lived in the left bank of the city. So now we have the Hotel Royal des Invalides, which is the it's right here. So now it's like it used to be a hotel for or a residence of the Invalides, and now it's different. It's a military museum, but it's in the 7th arrondissement, and it's a retirement home for war veterans, which was its original purpose. And Louis XIV created this in 1670. In the 14th of July, 1789, it was stormed by Parisian rioters, and they got all the weapons to use against the Bastille later the same day. Napoleon is entombed under the dome of the Invalides, and that happened in 1840, as we mentioned. Next up here we see the monument of Louis the 16th. That's another monument that's interesting. It's also called the Chapelle Expiatoire, and it's a chapel located in the 8th arrondissement, and it's dedicated to the Louis the 16th and his wife Marie Antoinette, although they are formally buried in the Basilica of Saint Denis. So this chapel was designated in 1816, and it was finished during the second year of the reign of Charles X in 1826. Next, we're moving down to this area here, Barriere La Cunette, which is it's right here. It was in front of a metro station, the Montpiquet. And this port at that time consisted of a single building with 2 arches. It's not there anymore, but it gave it its name, and it was very picturesque, but also a place of entertainment. According to some accounts, it was a great place to grab food and had several types of entertainment. And according to some of my research, in 1831, it was also a place of prostitution, so it was a mixed bag back then. It was also along the Farmers General Wall, so there was passages. And these passages were called barriers. So you'll see a lot of these barriers along this route here. And they had propylées, which is buildings or granting offices. So as they enlarged Paris, only 4 were kept, and they're used to collect taxes. So that pretty much sums up our history of Paris in the 19th century. And we have one more video coming out talking about more modern times. But it was really interesting exploring the world of the 1800s France and learning a lot more about how different it is back then and compared to today. So I hope that you have a really lovely week ahead, and thank you so much.